Hey crew, it's Pitt and I am back with some more Esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Hiram Butler. This is The Goal of Life. We are up to chapter 6. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points of interest that come to light from the text. It is not the format for everybody, but some people seem to get enjoyment from it, so you are more than welcome to tag along. Before we begin, however, if you were unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there are several playlists that will be linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the source material, so that you can understand better where I am and where I'm coming from, how I got to the points I have. Once again, more than likely, today's point of interest will be the unconventional Bible study, which will absolutely be linked above, so that you can get a better understanding of exactly how I got there. There are 161 videos to explain that. With that being said, we are going to dive in and begin continue our exploration of the goal of life. Chapter 6, Other Worlds Than Ours. A subject of so vast proportions as the title of this chapter indicates, naturally suggests exhaustive study of the investigations of scientists, ancient and modern. But for the sake of brevity, and because the conclusions of ancient philosophy are not accepted in our time, we omit its consideration and confine ourselves to an examination of a small portion of modern investigation. The unity of opinion, however, on the part of our modern scientists and the fact that their investigations are accessible to everyone make it unnecessary to quote from them, more than just enough to show that the truth we are about to present are in trend with scientific mind of the day. It seems that the only objection science has to offer to the theory that the planets are inhabited is that the conditions existing upon them make life, as we know it, impossible. They object that upon certain of the planets, and especially upon the Sun, there is an absence of the conditions that make life possible upon our own Earth. But what do we mean by the terms life, living matter, and so on? In their investigations, physicists have reached the point where matter is reduced to a mere center of force, and where heat is only the rate of speed of motion in matter. In the light of these facts, can the line between living and non-living matter be drawn? It has never been drawn, and we are prepared to say that it never will be. Professor Bose, in his book entitled Response in the Living and Non-Living, claims to have scientifically demonstrated that there is no essential difference between animal, vegetable, or mineral life. He shows also that metals, like the animal organism, can be put to sleep, poisoned, revived, and finally killed. Thus, we are forced to the conclusion that what we call matter is a living organism. It should be remembered that iron is purified by fire. I'm giving them a chance to explain this. Purified by fire, as in fact are all the metals. It does not kill the life of iron or steel to put it in the furnace and melt it. On the contrary, it seems to bring it to a condition where the life qualities are more perfectly manifested. And our Earth, science tells us, has come from a state of incandescence. Intense heat has prepared it to bring forth living organisms. Yes, more, the heat is absolutely essential to the perpetuation of these organisms. It is true that our own life requires what we call a moderate amount of heat, but it is well known that there are microbes that, subjected to very intense heat, still live. If life, in its diminutive form, exists under such conditions, may not the same possibility for life exist in the more highly organized forms? May there not be organisms of intelligence, great and mighty minds, whose natural element is a heat transcending our own imagination? Okay, so on the one hand, I do not discount this completely and totally out of hand. We talked yesterday about the spiritual evolution journey, right? And I believe that is a possibility, that not necessarily that carbon is thinking, but that it is trying to be the best carbon atom that it can be within the instinctuals of itself. Our method of thinking does not necessarily denote life, right? Amoebas are life, bacteria is life, and there is no indication that they have thought. And so I don't require thought to be a foundation of life. I do not require life to be something that we recognize it now. I do not doubt that somewhere out there is life that would be incompatible with what we have. The immensity of the universe is just too broad for it to be just this one planet that supports life. I don't know about life on the sun, but I'm not going to entirely discount that either, right? Our understanding of the sun is not nearly complete. It is most probably not just a big ball of fusion, right? As has been intimated by most of the scientific community. I stand at odds with large parts of the scientific community for a variety of reasons. I believe that it is a conductor of energetic materials, right? It is like a diode. It is receiving energy from somewhere and merely distributing it that somewhere else. There is a conversion process that takes place, and that may very well be fusion. But I believe that the fuel source, or not really the fuel source, the heat source, is more of an external, probably through cold plasma being transferred into warm plasma and then emitted out as radioactivity. So I don't immediately discount the entirety of this, but some of the logic getting there seems to be a little bit less than ideal, so to speak. So while I do not discount life on the moon, right? They have found traces of water on the moon, if you were unaware. They have found traces of water on several other planets. That doesn't mean that life is there now. It may have existed at one point and gone away. It could be that our planet got hit by something a long time ago and tore off a chunk, and it made the moon, and therefore we have residual traces of water on the moon, right? All of these are possibilities. I don't stand too firmly in these things, but I do want to point out that life does not have to necessarily look the way that we do, but you need to be logically consistent and understandable in your delivery of how you got there, right? I don't discount that there could be silicon-based life forms. It is the closest to carbon, and while carbon makes up our structure, it is entirely possible that silicon makes up someone else's structure. It could be any of the other elements as well. There could very well be a planet where oxygen is the main structure for life. Seems like it would be a little bit difficult, but it is entirely possible. And so we'll get back to the text, but I had to point that out. The biblical account states that the 3 Hebrew children were thrown into a furnace. They were not children, heated 7 times hotter than it was wont. That Nebuchadnezzar, looking in, saw a 4th form like unto a man, and that the 3 Hebrews came out unharmed. The Bible also declares that God is a consuming fire, and while such quotations have no scientific bearing, they at least show that the revelation seeks to impress upon our minds not only that the cause of all life and being is fire, but that fire in itself is more like God than anything else that we know. Or that's just what they had available to describe a power that they could not control. This is in harmony with the scientific conclusion that every substance originated in fire. What? I am unaware of this particular thing. Like I guess you could say Big Bang was like a big fire and that it created everything. But as far as I know, there is no overarching theory of this. If I am wrong, let me know in the comments down below. I will absolutely investigate that, and I will retract if necessary. But I don't know about this one. The incandescent gas from which the worlds were made, and may not the Christ have announced a law when he said, wait, this is in harmony with the scientific conclusion that every substance originated in fire, the incandescent gas from which the worlds were made. So plasma, we discussed that before. And may not the Christ have announced a law when he said, I came out from God and I returned to God? Yeah. If the planets came out from fire, may they not return to fire? If God, the source of all mind, of all life, of all action, in short, of all there is a consuming fire, and if the highest angels that the earth's inhabitants have ever seen appear as flaming fire, is it not reasonable to believe that those blazing suns that illuminate the heavens are abodes of high and holy beings whose very substance is a flame of fire? That takes a great deal more belief than I am subject to. When we say their very substance is a flame of fire, do not allow your mind to think of fire from the standpoint of a child. Science has demonstrated that fire is nothing more or less than what is called matter in great activity, the atoms of which are in violent vibration. And there are evidences in human life that the higher the organism, the more rapid are the vibrations of the life currents in the organism. I don't necessarily disagree completely with that either. So that if we allow our reason full scope in connection with what has already been accepted as divine revelation, and as the truths of science, we may believe, with good reason, that all the heavenly bodies are inhabited. Again, that is a logical fallacy, right? That is making a series of assumptions that have no backing whatsoever. Keep in mind that the time frame when this was written was just before the turn of the last century, not this one, so in the late 1800s. And so they did not quite have any understanding whatsoever of the outer realm. There was no rocketry, much less the ability to go into space or fly satellites, which are things. The earth is not flat. There is no dome over the top of it. If that bothers you, you're definitely in the wrong place. But that all heavenly bodies are inhabited, while I do not necessarily discount that, I do not necessarily believe that, right? You would have to present me with proof that there is life on Mars, not just that you believe there is life on Mars. While inquiring into the fact relative to the universe, the reader should remember that the search is not merely for the wonderful, but for the purpose of confirming and enlarging our conception of God. The answer to the question, are the planets and suns inhabited, that naturally arises in the mind, necessarily reveals the wonders and greatness of the mind, the consciousness, the intelligence that we call spirit, God, the cause of all things. Astronomers, in their investigation of the solar system, perceive that the larger planets lying beyond our own are less dense and to a certain degree self-luminous, and they inquire, is it possible for life to exist upon these worlds? Such a question can be answered only by logical deduction. Okay, we are going to talk about this real quick. In their investigation of the solar system, they perceive that the larger planets lying beyond our own are less dense. That is not necessarily true. It is true, Jupiter is a gas giant, right? So it is more than likely less dense than this, but others are probably not. Just because some of it may be does not mean that all of it is. That is an assumption that seems to be being placed in this quite frequently, right? There can be more dense areas, right? Like some of the planets may be made up of more iron than we are, and therefore they are more dense than we are. Now, we have a large degree of iron in our crust, and so we are relatively dense, but it rests upon a sea of magma, which is less dense than the crust in which it is made. So just keep in mind, right? The best intellects will say, if we have to consider these things at all, we must search for the most logical hypotheses, and there wait until evidence is multiplied to assure us of their correctness or incorrectness. That and yes. In the absence of inspiration, if men cannot trust their reason, there is nothing that they can trust. Therefore, very little is accepted as fact in regard to the systems of the universe. In order to reach conclusions by means of the reason, we must first examine facts upon our own planet, and from these facts draw inferences as to what exists upon other worlds. Turning our attention to our own world and traversing the extreme north among icebergs and perpetual snows, we find there the Eskimos and many forms of animal life. Going to the hottest part of our globe, we find that inhabited. In fact, we find no place too hot, no place too cold, no place too barren. That's not true. In short, no conditions existing on our globe which make life impossible. There are no natural indigenous settlements in Antarctica. There are no natural indigenous settlements in the North Pole. They get awfully close, right? The Bering Sea and the areas in the far north are inhabited to a large degree, but there are vast tracts that are completely uninhabited because they are too barren and they are too cold. Now, too hot, I don't think so. I think that we as a species have acclimated to warmth much more readily than we have to cold. As a matter of fact, you can trace back most of the problems in humanity to the fact that the temperature got a lot colder and we were not able to grow as much food. The Dark Ages, right? The Dark Ages is definitely one of those examples. We had a mini cooling period where it got a lot harder to grow things to eat, and therefore a lot of people died. It seems to be that the warmer the planet is, the better humanity expands. So there is something in here, but also there's not a lot of people that live in Death Valley, right? They live around it, that is true, but they don't really choose to reside within the valley itself, and that has been true pretty much throughout history. It is just simply too fucking hot. Furthermore, the geologist has been able to turn a few pages of nature's past history, and he has discovered the remains of weird and strange creatures. Indeed, it is impossible to picture the great diversity of vegetable and animal life which has been found to exist on this globe. Life which it would be unable to support under the present terrestrial conditions. That is true. He has been able to turn pages that extend over millions of years, but he has found no period that does not give evidence of life. That is not true. There are periods of, well, the complete absence of life, I'll grant you, because we have not had full scope of everything, right? It isn't like I believe in the disaster cycle. When I said that is true, that is what I'm talking about. Like the possibility that there was a vapor canopy at some point. What does that mean? That the air was thicker with humidity, that there was less ice, that there was more readily available the fluids, right? They formed a barrier, and that it made our sky look different. It wasn't blue, it was more of a purple. That it was a thicker, denser canopy of vapor that surrounded us. And because of that, the solar radiation coming in was different, the atmospheric conditions, the weather patterns, all of those are different things because of that. Now, I believe that is intricately tied to the 12,000-year disaster cycle, and that it is in large part to explain for the megafauna that used to exist here. And by that I mean the dinosaurs. I know that there are people who do not believe that dinosaurs existed. You are wrong. There was life well before humanity was walking the earth, and some of that was extremely large. Now, there is some reason to believe that humanity walked alongside some of these megafauna, and that even possibly humanity was we're considered megafauna now because we are larger than 100 pounds, I think is the threshold. But there is significant reason to believe that there were giant humans, right? And that doesn't mean that they were Homo sapien gigantus, right? They were like exactly like us in logic, reasoning, and facilities. There's good reason to believe that they had 6 fingers instead of 5. But there is significant reason to believe that those things existed outside of just the Bible, right? The Smithsonian is famous for losing that evidence, however, and so we no longer have it. There are written records. You can dismiss them if you wish. You can explain them away if you wish, but I believe that was conditional upon the vapor canopy. I don't believe that anybody out there fully understands that, myself included, and that's why I don't expand upon the vapor canopy all that much, but it does seem like it could have been a thing. The guys over at Thunderbolts Project do a fairly good job of explaining why we have several of our iconographies, right? The things that we use as symbology, the Rose Cross, for instance, and the swastika, the original one, not the ones that the Nazis corrupted. Those represented, in my estimation, something that we saw in the sky. And the change that brought about by the 12,000 year disaster cycle completely fundamentally changed how those things work. And so we no longer see those things, even though once they probably did exist. Once again, check out the Thunderbolts Project if you would like to see more information on that type of thing. Finally, it has been proved that the earth itself is a body of life. Its very substance is life. Sometime we shall know that there is no such thing as dead matter, that all is mind, spirit, or soul substance. And we talk about the Trinity all the time. We believe that the majority of those who have studied our system and the universe in general agree with the astronomer Proctor in Other Worlds Than Ours when he says concerning the habitability of planets and systems of the world. I have already spoken of the conclusions to be drawn from the existence of the same materials in the substance of the sun that exist around us on this earth. I have shown that we are compelled to regard this general resemblance of structure as sufficient to prove that the other planets resemble the earth, since we have no reason to believe that our earth bears an exceptionally close resemblance to the sun as respects the elements of which she is composed. Since, then, we have reason to believe that all the planets which circle around the sun are constituted of the same materials which exist in his substance, though these materials are not necessarily, nor probably, combined in the same proportions throughout the solar system, we have every reason, which analogy can give us, for believing that the planets circling around Betelgeuse or Aldebaran are constituted of the same materials which exist in the substance of their central luminary. Thus we are led to a number of interesting conclusions, even respecting the orbs, which no telescope that man can construct is likely to reveal to his scrutiny. The existence of such elements as sodium or calcium in those other worlds suggests the probable existence of the familiar compounds of these metals: soda, salt, lime, and so on. Again, the existence of iron and other metals of the same class carries our minds to the various useful purposes which these metals are made to subserve on the earth. We are at once invited to recognize that the orbs circling around those distant suns are not meant merely to be the abode of life, but that intelligent creatures capable of applying these metals to useful purposes must exist in those worlds. We need not conclude, indeed, that at the present moment every one of those worlds is peopled with intelligent beings, because we have good reason for believing that throughout an enormous proportion of time during which our earth has existed as a world with no intelligent use has been made of the supplies of metal existing in her substance. But that at some time or other those worlds have been, or will be, the abode of intelligent creatures seems to be a conclusion fairly deducible from what we know of their probable structure. And again, we are reminded that this was pre-rocketry, right? Pre the invention of our current telescopic abilities. We have much improved telescopes. We can see in fairly good detail most of the outer structure of the planets. Like, we can't see into the gas cloud of Jupiter, right? The great red spot, we can see the spot, but we can't see underneath it, even though the spot is gone and now there are two in different places. There is reason to believe that there is change in the universe, however. That red spot being one of the key ways to do so. But the climate change that we are currently afflicted by seems to be afflicting all of the planets in the system as well, and that is definitely something that you should look into, because if I tell you too much about it, you'll never get to see this video. Thus, the fact that the stars send forth heat to the worlds which circle around them suggests at once the thought that on those worlds there must exist vegetable and animal forms of life. Must is a big word. We should not use big words. That natural phenomena, such as we are familiar with as due to the solar heat, must be produced in those worlds by the heat of their central sun. and that works such as those of which man undertakes on earthworks, in which intelligent creatures use nature's powers to master nature to their purposes, must go on in the worlds which circle around Aldebaran and Betelgeuse, around Vega, Capella, and the blazing Sirius. That is logical fallacy. Professor Proctor's reasoning here is good so far as it goes, and we believe meets with general approval. No. His reasoning that again, I don't discount the fact that there can be life elsewhere, that there may even be life on some of the planets that orbit these stars that are listed, but to logically assume that that is a truth is beyond logic, right? Yes, there is probably life out there, but to assume that you know where it's at simply because some of the conditions are met is not. And again, life does not have to be us. It doesn't even have to be incorporated in the way that we are. It can be something that we don't understand, but so far, we have not discovered that. His reasoning that the fact that these instrumentalities of use exist is in it itself an evidence that there are intelligences to use them. No, that does not. Is good because all who have given thought to nature's methods see that use determines all qualities, whether good or evil, and that if nothing exists in this world that has not a use, and if there is an intelligent creator, it certainly would impeach his intelligence. It even impeaches the intelligence of a man to be constantly producing useless things. Only an idiot would sit and work continuously when no object or use could be accomplished. People do it all the time. When an intelligent man is employed in work, he seeks to serve a use. Is God less intelligent than man? Just because you don't understand a use does not mean that there is no use, right? An asteroid passing by can merely influence gravimetric pressures and change something that you don't even understand. And so this rock going through space, which seems useless, can have a use. That doesn't mean that it was meant to be that way. That doesn't mean that that is actually what is happening, but it is something that you should at least consider if you were going to make definitive statements. Can we imagine that these untold millions of worlds exist only to beautify our little grain of sand? Such thoughts are unworthy of intelligent beings. No doubt the present theory that the sun is an incandescent mass because the solar rays on striking the earth generate heat is destined soon to be superseded by one more worthy of the intelligence of our day, Professor Proctor says. And they actually did think it's not incandescent, right? Incandescent is, I believe it's more incandescent than they do. They believe that it is a self-generating light, and incandescence is more of a catalyst being acted upon. In my understanding, I could be wrong in that, right? An incandescent light bulb is electricity flowing through a filament and causing the light. It's not the filament itself, it is the electricity interacting with the actual core material that causes incandescence. That is more in line with what I believe than it is with what current science believes, which they believe that it is a fission, and the release from the fission is what causes the light. And I'm not entirely sure that incandescence is the wrong word for that, right? But it seems more like radiant would be than incandescence, right? My understanding could be wrong. I haven't looked up the word incandescent in a very long time, but if I'm wrong, let me know down below. I don't have a problem with being wrong. Professor Proctor says, we know that the sun is the sole source whence light and heat are plentifully supplied to the worlds that circle around him. We assume that. Yes, to a large degree, but to say only is a big one. The question immediately suggests itself, whence does the sun derive those amazing stores from whence it is continually supplying his dependent worlds? We know that, were the sun a mass of burning matter, he would be consumed in a few thousand years. We know that were he simply a heated body, radiating heat and light continually into space, he would, in like manner, have exhausted all his energies in a few thousand years, a mere day in the history of his system. Whence, then, comes the enormous supply of force which he has afforded for millions of years, and which, also, our reason tells us he will continue to afford while the worlds which circle around him have need of it. In other words, for countless ages yet to come. The recent discovery of radium has already suggested to many astronomers that our sun and all the suns of the universe may be luminous from another cause than fire, as fire is generally known, that there is a light that has the appearance of fire, like the burning bush that burned but was not consumed, which Moses saw when he was commissioned to deliver Israel from bondage. That which is called fire has been a mystery through all time, and is as much a mystery today as it was in the days of the fire worshippers. Yea, more of a mystery today, for the child race lived so near to nature that the thought formed in its brain was, by virtue of the universal mind, and came nearer the truth in many respects, than the mind that has shut itself against everything that cannot be demonstrated in the physical. When our philosophers have fully accepted the fact that the so-called blazing suns are not blazing with consuming fire, but with an illuminating property, which perhaps will always be beyond the power of the deepest research to fathom, then their theories will be reversed. Revelation says that God is a consuming fire, so that until they are able to comprehend something of God, they can never fully comprehend the cause of light. We repeat, when philosophers are able to grasp this thought, they will find that in reasoning from analogy concerning nature's methods, they will need make no leaps. Evolution is generally accepted as the universal law. It is certainly the law of all things that we know on the earth. Gradual development, see back to yesterday's video on evolution. Gradual development seems to characterize everything that exists. It is said that every generation becomes weaker and wiser. As mind develops in the man, the physical strength and avoirdupois lessens. Everything points to the truth of the statement in Revelation that all growth, evolutionary processes, is carrying the whole creation onward and upwards towards the likeness of its cause. And if the first cause of all things is spirit, and the tendency of all things is towards spirit, then it follows that the avoirdupois, the density of substance, must decrease, as not man only, but worlds go on in their process of refinement and spiritualization. There is a marked difference between the organisms of the lower races and the organisms of the higher. We know, too, that there is a marked difference in the light that shines from the face of a highly intellectual organism, especially when the mind is clear and active, and everything in the body is at the best, and in the light from the face of a lower type. A natural light shines forth from a highly spiritualized face, a light that is not imaginary but real, a light that anybody that is in the habit of observing can see, even from a distance. That is true. And I say, that I'm definitive on because I can see it. So I know what he's talking about there. We have talked about the auras before. Some years ago, I called on a friend who, I keep hitting this mic, I'm sorry. I called on a friend who, on my arrival, was not at home, but soon after he came in and stepped from the hall into the back parlor, I was sitting in the front parlor by the window. And as he looked in while taking off his overcoat, I said to his wife, "What is the matter with Mr. B?" She inquired why I asked, and I replied, "His face is so dark." She then informed me that he had been out on business, which there was much trouble and anxiety. All this had cast over his face a shadow, a darkness so marked that it could be seen the length of the room. Probably all who are observant have noticed that a condition of anxiety or disappointment throws a shadow over the face, making the countenance actually shadowy and dark. That is true. It affects your aura too. Right? You can actually see it. I've always been able to identify people who are pregnant. right? Even when they didn't know themselves sometimes, I've been like, hey, are you pregnant? And they're like, no. And then they take a test, and it turns out that yes, they are. That has been a thing, right? That is something, again, you don't have to believe, but it is a truth in my life. And so I have been able to see that. I can also tell when people are depressed. I can tell when people are anxious. I can see it. And so this, to me, is something that is true. If, then, in ordinary life, a state of mind illuminates or darkens the countenance, and many readers will bear witness to this statement, is not this fact at least a suggestion that the more highly developed the soul, the greater the luminosity that emanates from the body? We are told many times in sacred history that celestial visitants were shining as the light, in some cases so bright that they could not be looked upon. Development means the increasing and the intensifying of the life energy, which beyond a certain point reaches luminosity. The fact that development and spiritualization are always accompanied by illumination has been accepted by all spiritually developed men, and by those who know something of mature souls that have passed into the spirit world. Like, again, I do believe in the auras. I do believe that this is a thing. I get really, really tied up when you say all, right? All spiritually developed men do the exact same thing. That's a problem for me. I have trouble with what I call big words, right? All, absolutes. Like, when you're dealing with those things, I like to hold out the possibility of something else, right? So while it is entirely possible that everybody who has been spiritually illuminated is able to see the same things that I am, it is not necessarily a fact. And so I hold out that some people who are spiritually illuminated may not be able to see the same things that I do. So when they say that all spiritually developed men, for me, that is a hard word to accept. That all. If it would have been accepted by spiritually developed men, then I would not have as big of a problem with it. I have trouble with the big words. And all is by no means a big word, right? It is a big word. Has been accepted by all spiritually developed men and by those who know something of mature souls that have passed on into the spirit world. And from the evidence that we have been able to gather, we have come to the conclusion that as the worlds age and develop, they, as well as their inhabitants, become more spiritualized and luminous. We reason that there can be nothing born, nothing come into manifestation without a parent, let it be plant, animal, or man. In continuing the analogy, we are forced to the conclusion that there is a parental source for every world. And if worlds have a parentage, then we necessarily reject the nebular hypothesis, so far as it relates to the formation of worlds independent of the sun around which they revolve. If worlds form from nebulae in space without any parental agency, then we conclude that life may be born on our planet without the agency of parentage. In fact, we are left open to accept almost any theory. It is not so unreasonable to suppose that a mother could bring forth a child without a father as to believe that the world can be formed without a father or mother. That's an interesting way to place that statement. Right? It is not so unreasonable to suppose that a mother could bring forth a child without a father as to believe that a world can be formed without a father or a mother. I believe in God, 1,000%. I don't believe in the virgin conception at all. On the other hand, it is evident that worlds are ruled by the same law that governs individuals, that our sun has brought forth and thrown into space a system of worlds, and that some of these worlds have begun to have a family of their own. It is not known if the younger planets, that is, Venus and Mercury, have moons, but Earth has one child, the moon, Mars has 2, Jupiter 7, and Saturn 10. So we conclude that as worlds are born from their parent suns, they are less in size, denser, and more opaque, and need the more direct rays of their parent sun for growth and maturity. That is one way of looking at it. But as ages roll on, these worlds grow and become more self-existent, more refined and luminous, and organize for themselves a family of worlds, shedding their light upon their children's life. Thus is carried forward the work of birth and development in all systems of suns and worlds. And if it is a law that the progress of every world is from density and opacity to refinement and luminosity, then the astronomical observations that many of the suns floating in space are less dense than our sun, and that the outermost planets of our solar system are less dense than the inner planets, are undoubtedly correct and substantiate our conclusion. That is not true. We believe it is generally accepted that light is due to a certain speed of electric vibrations. Kind of. We have been led to say that light is life in motion, and light on one plane of existence is darkness to another. That is less true. For instance, we have animals or birds on our planet at the present time that evidently never saw the sun. The light of the sun to them is darkness. A good illustration of this is the owl. The owl may be sitting upon a fence or the limb of a tree, and if the sun is shining brightly, you may approach him and he is apparently blind. But as the shadows begin to deepen, he begins to see a little, and when total darkness reigns, he sees plainly. This is not only true of the owl, but of many insects, birds, and animals. I'm going to go ahead and interject here that is patently untrue. Owls are nocturnal, so it is a natural assumption that he is making here, but scientific discovery has shown that to be false. Because while owls are indeed nocturnal, they are not exclusively nocturnal. There are many times during the day when owls will actually fly from this perch to that perch. They may not necessarily be hunting. I'm not sure how much hunting they do in the daytime, but it is a thing that has happened, I am sure. But they do move, right? Most of the time they don't, because they are sleeping during the day, and that is why you're able to sneak up on them. Because they are unconscious, they are sleeping. Not because they are blind, right? The same fallacy is made with bats. Bats do have a rudimentary sense of sight, but they use echolocation more because they are nocturnal, so they have lesser facilities for light. There are, however, other species that could have been used in better example of this. There are albino fish that live deep in caves, and they have never seen the light of sun. That would have been a better example to use. This was an assumption. This is at least a suggestion of the following general law. Let me kick that back around for y'all. Namely, that when a world is born from its central sun, it receives its light and heat from that center, and that it cannot even see light emanating from a higher center, nor feel the heat from a higher center, for the vibrations of that higher center cannot touch it. If we believe that there are inhabitants on our moon, that the earth would be to them a sun, and that they would have no consciousness of our sun, that is a wild assumption right there. The same would be true of all the satellites of Mars, Jupiter, and the other planets. We see the sun and feel its light and are dependent upon its emanating light for our existence, because it is our parent. And we believe that when the inhabitants of the earth have developed to a higher plane of existence, they will begin to see shining worlds in space that are now entirely invisible to us. Suns and systems so glorious and bright, so refined and ethereal, that their emanations do not touch anything that belongs to us, and therefore we know nothing of their existence, so that there may be suns immensely greater and brighter than our sun, even nearer to us than our sun, and yet we know nothing about them. Again, we quote from Professor Proctor's book entitled Other Worlds Than Ours. Or, if we estimate Jupiter rather by the forces inherent in his system, if we contemplate the enormous rapidity with which his vast bulk whirls around upon his axis, or trace the stately motion with which he sweeps onward in his orbit, or measure the influences by which he sways his noble family of satellites, we are equally impressed with the feeling that here we have the prince of all the planets, the orb which all the others in the solar scheme suggest to us the conceptions of the noblest forms of life. The very symmetry and perfection of the system which circles around Jupiter have led many to believe that he must be inhabited by races superior in intelligence to any which people our earth. The motions of these bodies afford, indeed, to our astronomers a noble subject of study. Once again, there are assumptions in here that I do not necessarily believe. It is entirely possible that there is a race that we have no comprehension of that live there, but again, we don't have the proof of that. We have sent probes, we have sent spacecraft to go and video and send things back, and we have not found evidence thereof. So, and again, lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. That is a big problem that people have too. Just because you can't prove something doesn't mean that it is not necessarily true. It just means that you may not have found the way to prove it. And so the lack of evidence is not the evidence of lack. There can be something beyond your comprehension. So there could be a life form, even an ethereal life form, that is entirely non-corporeal. It is possible. We just don't have the evidence of it. Now, I have been visited, right? So I'm a little bit different. I believe things that people don't. I have had extra experiences. I have had supernatural experiences. I have been visited by an angel. I have been taken out of my body by supernatural forces beyond my control. So I have a little bit more leeway than you would find in the scientific world. But I still demand a lot of it, like, okay, we have those bodies here, but I'm not going to project that thought that they must live on Jupiter. In the course of all worlds, as well as in the course of their inhabitants, is from grosser to finer, and that is again an assumption, then the inevitable conclusion is that this sun, our parent world, must be a planet in a state of development so far beyond, so much more spiritualized than our world, that its light is spiritual fire. And if our central luminary has been born from another world, we may expect that the parent of our sun is as much beyond our sun in luminosity, refinement, and spirituality as our sun is more luminous than our earth. Again, that is some self-insertion. Following the same analogy leads us to say that the parent of our sun must have a parent from which it was born, and that it is also transcendentally more refined and spiritualized than its child. If worlds are born from their parents and become luminous suns, their density decreasing, or in other words, if they become more refined, then, by an ever-increasing ratio, we may trace on, infinitely on, from child to parent in world life until worlds become so refined and attenuated that they are, so far as we are able to discern, immaterial. It also follows from the mutual relation of a planet and its people, as those luminous worlds unfold and develop, so their inhabitants unfold and develop, becoming together more refined and luminous. And as this refinement and spiritualization is the law of growth, there necessarily is a point where these immense worlds, with their inhabitants, become invisible, even spirit substance to our comprehension. And if worlds have existed from all eternity, then it is necessarily follows that all space throughout the immensity of the universe is filled and interfilled with worlds and systems of worlds, each governed by its own law, and each becoming higher and still higher, more spiritual, and yet more spiritual, fine and ethereal, so that our solar system may be floating through a body of immense worlds, so refined, so spiritualized, that we have no consciousness of their presence, nor they of ours. Thus, the manifestations of God, Spirit, are without limit, as to extent and planes of existence. Here, our finite thoughts ends, but we see that there is no place where there is not an expression of God, a body, formed by that Spirit that is omnipresent, who is the formless mind and will of all universes, formless, yet forming all things, expressionless, yet organizing forms to become the expression of his own great mind. And thus, we find ourselves thinking of God, Spirit, formless substance, continually forming and expressing himself through the forms that he has made. Addendum. We quote from the Literary Digest, New York, November 10th, 1906. The following excerpts from the work of... So this isn't the 1800s, it's the early 1900s, my bad. The following excerpts from the work of Professor Kirschman and comments as they furnish interesting thought on the line of the foregoing chapter. Life in other worlds. The probability, or even the possibility, of life in other worlds than our own is denied by the veteran English scientist Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace in his book on Man's Place in the Universe. This opinion is vigorously combated in a pamphlet reprinted from the Transactions of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, Toronto, 1906, by Dr. A. Kirschman, professor of philosophy in the University of Toronto. Space forbids allusion to all of Dr. Kirschman's arguments, but he makes in particular an ingenious use of the hypothesis of the relativity of things, which is worthy of notice. To the relativity of magnitudes, for instance, he will admit absolutely no limit, and he therefore maintains the possibility of living beings so huge that every molecule of their bodies is as great as our solar system, or so small that countless hosts of them may dwell together in one of our molecules. Perhaps, he says, the whole galactic system is nothing but one cell of an immense organism. To one who holds this view of matter and life, argument designed to show that there are no human beings on Venus or Mars are evidently inadequate. Says Professor Kirschman, we must not forget that the greatness of the universe known to us is only relative. The law of relativity of all magnitudes is not a speculation, but a fact which is given with every experience and which can be verified at any moment. But we have become accustomed to close our eyes to it. There is absolutely nothing, great or small, in the world, and the mathematical conception, so much indulged in, of the approximation to zero is one of the worst fictions which human intelligence ever invented. There can be no part of substance or of empty space, though ever so small, which, regarded from another standpoint, is not a large part of matter or of space. Consequently, a single molecule of chalk with its atoms of calcium and oxygen and carbon, these again consisting of millions of ions, and these again of subions, and so on ad infinitum, may be a whole solar system again, with a central body and planets and satellites containing life in many forms, but for our measure too small to ever be perceived. And, on the other hand, the whole universe, as far as we can fathom it, may be only a small aggregation of particles or cells of a greater and higher organism absolutely unfathomable by us. That I do agree with, right? I say quite frequently that we are a tiny fragment of God, given individualized free will. You are given the choice to go forth and do. You're given a meat suit to do it in, but the Spirit is what allows it, right? Now, the Spirit is God, and God to me is so vast that it is inconceivable to our finite minds. I try to explain that in ways that are logically consistent, right? But even my efforts are too small. Absolutely. There is no way that I could ever define the immensity of God. But one of the ways that I use is that we, this individualized piece, are like a single individualized piece of a fingernail. The piece of the fingernail is absolutely part of God, but it is not God in its entirety. And the scope of the entirety of the human body and all of the complicated procedures which make up the human body, digestion, respiration, defecation, all of these things are beyond the scope of that tiny piece of fingernail to even conceive of. And so that is how I explain what he just said in very large part, right? I don't necessarily disagree with this out of hand. But once again, we do not have confirmation in either direction of that. As above, so below is a truth, and it has proven true for almost everything. I don't know of anything in particular that it is not, right? The circulation of atoms in the way that they do, they call them ions here, but protons, neutrons, and electrons, the way that they move is in large part the exact same way that the solar system arranges itself. And so, somewhat similar to this infinity of magnitudes is the infinity of physical conditions which the writer invokes as another argument in favor of the possibility of life in other worlds. The laws of nature, it is true, may be constant throughout all space and all time. Though Professor Kirschman reminds us that even this is not susceptible of proof, but the variation of conditions may still be infinite. We have no reason to believe that life may not be possible under all these variations. For all conditions are relative just as magnitude is. For every change in temperature, in the intensity of gravity, and in the chemical composition of atmospheres, and for every possible combination of these three, there may be a specially adapted organism somewhere, says the writer. Physically, there is no such thing as cold. That is true. The transformation of the uniform series of possible physical temperatures from zero to infinite, different and only in intensity, into a manifoldness of two antagonistic qualities, heat and cold, with even a changeable 0 point between, is purely physical. If this 0 point can vary for us in the different seasons, or on account of the after effects and contrast, we should assume that it can vary considerably more under the conditions of gravity and pressure. Quick clarification on that: it is true. There is no such thing as cold. There is only the absence of heat. Right? You cannot make something colder. You can remove heat from it. That is an important distinction to remember when you are talking about these situations. It is said that life could not exist on Jupiter because its surface is still red hot. But if the 0 point of this sense of temperature of the Jovians is shifted for a few hundred degrees, they will have as pleasant a walk on that red surface as we do in the green grass. That concept is right, but not necessarily the factual details, right? After all, the ordinary notions of physical temperature as used in cosmology are rather vague and misleading. If temperature consists in time and space relations of the kinetic or dynamic elements of matter, or in the changes of those relations, then it is clear that the elements themselves, no matter whether they are atoms, centers of force, ions, or electrons, cannot have any temperature at all. That is true. Right? Temperature is an outside relative force. Even Wallace's contention that life is dependent on the presence of carbon, nitrogen, and water is not admitted by Professor Kirschman. Under present conditions, other elements enter into organic combination, and he sees no reason why the relative importance of these should not be vastly greater in other places and at other times. He would admit, perhaps, the possibility of a man made out of iron, bisulfate of carbon and chlorine. He says, to say that life is dependent upon the prevalence of the four organogens on the surface of a planet is, again, incorrect. They are only the organogens under the conditions of heat, gravity, and pressure as they prevail on our Earth. When we were talking about silicon-based life forms, that's what this is. Under other conditions of heat and pressure, other substances, iron, gold, silicon, may play the role of organogens and form compounds with similar characteristics as those very complex and changeable chemical, organic combinations, which respond with partial or complete decomposition to slight stimulation. The neglect of this circumstance is the greatest mistake all those who have hitherto written on the subject. To cap the climax, our knowledge of our own relationship to the external world is only relative. Professor Kirschman says of this, there is one more point which should make us modest with regards to our statements about what is possible in other worlds. We are accustomed to think that we are a part of this world, an item in space and time, but this is a matter of belief, not of knowledge or science. On closer examination, we find that what we can say with certainty is that the whole world as we know it is a part of us, of our consciousness. Not that we are in space and time, but space and time are in us. They are the glasses through which alone we can see. We can look through them, but not at them. Go back to my talk about the spiritual evolution. We can look through them, but not at them. If we attempt to take them off, to look at them, we are totally blind. What they are objectively we do not know. They are the tools with which consciousness works. Time and space are for us the instruments with which we grasp the world. We have a lease of these instruments, and usually a lease for less than 99 years. Whether with different mental instruments other worlds may be open to us, whether the evil in this world is real or only a distortion produced by the inadequacy of the tools or the imperfection of us who handle them, we cannot know in this life. We may discover when the lease runs out. And that is going to pretty much wrap up with this one. I don't know that I have a whole lot left to add to this, right? Relativity is a thing. Certainty is a little bit less. It is entirely possible that there are other life forms out in the universe. We just do not have experience with them. Bacterial life is almost certainly a guarantee out there somewhere, somehow. Higher advanced life forms is a little bit less of a guarantee. But, in my opinion, if this is the only place in space where life exists, it is an immense waste of resources. And I don't believe that God is wasteful. I do, however, believe that we do not have a full concept of these things, that there is an ethereal life that goes on outside of us. That is something that I am getting some experience with. And so I can speak with a little bit of definiteness that there is something, but again, that can be subjective to me. I believe that what I do, right, when I talk about all of the magic and the things that I talk about, I believe that you can do that too, that it is not exclusive to me, that other people talk about the same things in different ways. Part of what we're doing here is exploring those possibilities. So I do not hold out that there is absolutely no life anywhere except for here, right? That would be a little bit foolish. But until we have evidence thereof, to say definitively that there is a little bit beyond the realm of credulity. It is entirely possible that the incorporeal beings that I have experienced have origins elsewhere. But I do not have the evidence thereof, so I am not going to say that. I have seen them here, however, so they are probably attached to here. That I have a little bit more certainty of, but again, I am not the expert on the entities. I don't play with them like that. I play with me. I work on my forces. The energy and the magnetics of myself, I can absolutely manipulate. I am doing that in ways that I cannot even tell you about, and I can't wait until I can, but I don't have the leaf for that yet. But I am changing my life in very real ways, and if you watch my videos quite closely, you will be able to see the evidence of that. The cyst is the least of those by this point. There are many other things going on which are wild, but I can't even talk about yet because it will affect other things that I cannot allow to be affected. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat complicated topics. I understand that I have some unconventional views and that I have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those views. It is not intentional, but I do not apologize for it. I am here to cast some light, and sometimes the shadows don't want that light being cast, so they get upset. They get offended or whatever. I try not to offend, believe it or not, but if you get offended by the truth, then you just need to be offended. If it hurts your butt that I am telling you something that I know is true, then okay, you're just going to be butthurt. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, and a sub. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree. If it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. And if you really, really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks, because I do not manifest money. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you were here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.